The street was bathed in the golden glow of a quiet suburban morning. Birds chirped, a sprinkler hissed lazily on a manicured lawn, and the hum of distant traffic was the only disruption to the stillness. Then came the sirens. Blaring and insistent, they shattered the serenity. A convoy of police vehicles screeched to a halt in front of Samuel Dawson's unassuming gray bungalow. Officers poured out, their purposeful movements transforming the sleepy cul-de-sac into a chaotic scene. "Move back! This is a restricted area," an officer barked, waving at curious onlookers who had started to emerge from their homes. Children clutching cereal bowls stared wide-eyed from porches, while parents whispered nervously. Claire Bennett, clutching her coffee mug, stood frozen on her front lawn. The steaming cup felt hot against her hands, but she barely noticed. The Dawson house, once a symbol of neighborly charm with its well-tended rose bushes and neatly painted shutters, was now a fortress of suspicion. Yellow tape flapped in the breeze as officers set up a perimeter. "What's going on?" a man in sweatpants whispered to his wife. "Drugs, maybe? Or something worse," she murmured, craning her neck for a better look. Claire stood a few paces away, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. Memories of Samuel's warm smile and polite demeanor swirled in her mind. The man who had fixed her leaking sink, brought cookies to her son's birthday party, and lent her a shoulder to cry on couldn't possibly be at the center of this. Could he? A sharp clang interrupted her thoughts. Detectives had begun combing through the yard, and a faint buzz of unease settled over the crowd. It started with a shovel. An officer knelt, digging carefully into a patch of freshly turned soil near Samuel's garden. Gasps rippled through the air when a fragment of bone emerged from the earth. That's not an animal bone," someone whispered, their voice trembling. Another shovel strike, and a grim discovery followed. A skull. Dirt clinging to its hollow sockets. An officer shouted for backup, his voice tight with urgency. Claire's breath caught as she watched the scene unfold. More digging. More bones. One grave turned into 2, then 3. Each new revelation was a blow, striking at the fragile sense of security that had once blanketed their street. Claire's coffee mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the concrete. The noise jolted her, but she didn't flinch. Her mind was elsewhere, racing through the countless moments she had shared with Samuel. His voice echoed in her head. "You're stronger than you think, Claire. I'm always here if you need me." She shook her head, trying to reconcile the monster revealed before her with the man she had trusted, confided in. Had he been watching her with the same friendly smile while hiding these horrors beneath his feet? Her son's laughter rang faintly in her memory. Samuel had taught him how to ride his bike. A wave of nausea swept over her. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, a chorus of disbelief and guilt. "He was always so polite, who would have thought?" an elderly woman whispered. "How could we not see it?" another neighbor asked, their voice shaking. Claire turned to Ellen, her closest friend and confidant. Ellen's face was pale, her hands clenched tightly around her phone. "This doesn't make sense," Claire murmured, her voice barely audible. Ellen shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. "It does. We just didn't want to see it." Claire's stomach churned as her gaze drifted back to the house. The man who had once been the cornerstone of their community was now revealed as its destroyer. She didn't have the answers to the questions swirling in her mind, only an overwhelming sense of unease. The police continued their grim work, and the neighborhood stood, bound together by shock, as the skeletons, both literal and metaphorical, came tumbling out of Samuel Dawson's closet. The cul-de-sac shimmered under the gentle glow of the late afternoon sun. Children raced their bikes along the sidewalks, laughter echoing as sprinklers sprayed arcs of water over perfectly trimmed lawns. The air smelled faintly of barbecue, and neighbors exchanged warm greetings from porches. It was a place where doors were rarely locked, and secrets seemed unthinkable. Claire Bennett stepped out of her modest two-story home, the cool breeze teasing strands of her dark hair. Her lips curved into a faint smile as she watched the scene. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left casseroles on doorsteps and waved as they passed. But beneath its charming facade, shadows loomed, unseen and unspoken. Claire adjusted her scarf as she crossed her porch, the weight of her grief an invisible burden. Her husband, Michael, had been her anchor, her constant. But an accident on a rain-slicked highway had torn him from her life 6 months ago. Since then, every day felt like a battle. Her son, Liam, was her only solace, but even his laughter couldn't fill the silence that had become her new reality. It was in moments like these, standing alone amidst a bustling neighborhood, that her loneliness became unbearable. She glanced across the street at Samuel Dawson, her neighbor, who was meticulously trimming his hedges. His gaze met hers, and he waved. There was something grounding about his presence, an unspoken understanding that offered a strange sense of comfort. Samuel Dawson wasn't just any neighbor, he was the neighbor. In his 40s, with a receding hairline and a penchant for plaid shirts, Samuel embodied suburban kindness. He organized block parties, fixed broken fences, and always seemed to have a warm smile for everyone. When Claire's car battery died last month, Samuel had shown up with jumper cables and a thermos of coffee. "No trouble at all," he'd said, his voice soothing and steady. To the kids, he was Mr. Dawson, the man who handed out full-sized candy bars on Halloween. To the adults, he was the glue that held the street together. But to Claire, he was becoming something more. A confidant, a steady presence in the chaos of her life. It started with small conversations over the fence. "Claire," Samuel said one evening, leaning on his rake, "you look tired. Are you getting enough sleep?" She shrugged, grateful for his concern. "It's been hard. Liam's struggling too. I just feel lost." Samuel nodded, his expression somber. "Grief can do that. I lost my sister years ago. It leaves a hole nothing can quite fill." "It's possible he was right," Samuel added, as he too often felt sorrow for leaving. All those words broke something in her. She found herself confiding in him. About the nights she lay awake, the mornings she dreaded. Samuel listened, offering kind words and practical help, whether it was fixing a leaky faucet or babysitting Liam for an hour. For the first time since Michael's death, Claire felt less alone. But even as Samuel's kindness eased her burdens, cracks began to show. One evening, as Claire walked Liam home from a friend's house, she noticed a faint tapping noise coming from Samuel's basement window. It was rhythmic and sharp, like hammering. She paused, curiosity piqued. The next day, she casually brought it up. "What were you working on last night?" Samuel's smile faltered for just a second before it returned. "Oh, just some renovations. Nothing exciting." Another time, while borrowing a screwdriver, Claire noticed how tightly he kept his basement door locked. "What's in there?" she teased, laughing. "Just my tools," he said lightly, but his tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "Something about him feels off," Ellen said one afternoon, sipping iced tea on Claire's porch. Ellen was Claire's closest friend, blunt and fiercely protective. Claire frowned. "What do you mean? He's been nothing but kind." Ellen leaned in, lowering her voice. "Kindness doesn't mean innocence. Why does he avoid talking about his past? And those noises at night. It doesn't add up. Claire waved her off, though unease tugged at her thoughts. You're overthinking it. Samuel's been a lifeline. Just be careful, Ellen warned. Not everyone is who they seem. Tom Warner had been a cop for 3 decades before retiring to the neighborhood. He knew how to spot lies, and something about Samuel didn't sit right. I've seen men like him before, Tom muttered to his wife one evening. Too good to be true. He's hiding something. From his porch, Tom observed Samuel's habits, the late-night activity, the locked basement, the way he dodged personal questions. He didn't have proof, but his instincts told him to keep watching. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire sat on her couch, staring at the framed photo of her husband. Ellen's words lingered in her mind. Outside, Samuel's house stood silent, the curtains drawn. For the first time she felt a flicker of doubt, a crack in the trust she had placed in the man who had become her confidant. The cul-de-sac's calm was disrupted one afternoon when Mrs. Harper's orange tabby, Rufus, vanished. The cat was as much a fixture in the neighborhood as Samuel's garden, always lounging under porches or chasing shadows. I haven't seen him since yesterday, Mrs. Harper said, her voice tinged with worry as she spoke to Claire over the fence. He never misses dinner. Later that evening, Claire noticed Samuel in his yard, illuminated by the faint glow of a streetlight. He was digging, a deliberate, almost mechanical motion. She hesitated, clutching her coat tighter as a breeze sent a chill down her spine. Before digging farther, the first shards of sand whispered against her skin. Goodbye, grandmother. It's done. Burying something? She asked, half joking as she approached. Samuel straightened, dirt smudging his plaid shirt. Just some compost, he replied with a forced laugh. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Claire nodded, but couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe. A few days later, Claire's son Liam burst into the kitchen, holding something small and yellowish in his palm. Look what I found by Mr. Dawson's fence, he exclaimed. Claire's heart skipped. What is that? She asked, trying to mask her unease. Liam grinned, oblivious. It looks like a tooth. She snatched it from his hand, her stomach turning as she examined it. It didn't look like a toy or something plastic. It looked real, too real, and the more she tried to examine it, the more she questioned whether. Taking a deep breath, she walked over to Samuel's yard. Liam found this near your fence, she said, holding out the object. Samuel's face froze for a fraction of a second before he chuckled. Kids and their imaginations, probably from an old Halloween prop. He took it from her hand and tossed it into a trash bag. Claire forced a smile but felt her unease deepen as she walked away. The next morning, the pungent smell of chemicals wafted through the neighborhood. It seemed to originate from Samuel's garage. What on earth is that? Ellen muttered as she passed Claire's house. It smells like bleach, or something worse. Claire shrugged, trying to dismiss it. Maybe he's cleaning. Ellen's brows furrowed. No one cleans like that unless they're hiding something. At the block's weekly coffee gathering, Tom casually asked Samuel about his work. You've been in this neighborhood for years, but we don't know much about you, Tom said, his tone friendly but probing. Where were you before moving here? Samuel's jaw tightened. Why does it matter? He replied curtly. I mind my business, and I'd appreciate it if everyone else did the same. His sharp response silenced the group. Claire watched him retreat to his yard, tension twisting in her chest. Later that evening, Samuel knocked on Claire's door. She hesitated before letting him in. Claire, he began, his voice low and urgent. You've been a good friend, but some people around here, like Ellen and Tom, they're not who they seem. They've been spreading lies about me. Claire frowned. Lies? Why would they do that? They're jealous. Samuel said, leaning closer. They don't like how close we've become. They want to tear us apart. Her mind swirled with confusion. Could Ellen and Tom be wrong about Samuel? Or was something more sinister at play? As she sat on her couch that night, Claire's thoughts drifted to the countless conversations she'd had with Samuel since Michael's death. "I'm here for you, Claire," he'd said, his hand resting gently on hers. "You deserve to feel whole again." He had filled a void in her life, stepping in where no one else had. But now, as she pieced together his subtle manipulations, his ability to turn her grief into dependency, her chest tightened. Had she been blind to his true intentions all along? The next week, while picking up a wrench Samuel had loaned her, Claire noticed a folder sitting on his desk. The edge of a yellowed newspaper clipping poked out. In the sunlight, the words, "Henry Greenberg, the Rising Star," illuminated them. Curiosity got the better of her. She opened it quickly, scanning the articles. The headlines made her blood run cold. The Vikings, the engineered collapse of the earth, and the flooding of the Great Sea. Missing woman in Greenville. Another disappearance in Rolling Hills. Serial pattern in statewide cases. Each article was dated, with notes scribbled in the margins. Some included pictures of women who bore haunting similarities. Before she could process it fully, Samuel's voice startled her. "Find what you're looking for." She jumped, her heart pounding. "I was just borrowing a wrench," he interrupted, his smile too sharp. That night, Claire called Ellen. "I need your help," she whispered, her voice shaking. Ellen arrived with her laptop, and together they searched the names and locations from the clippings. "Oh my God," Ellen whispered, her face pale. "Every single one of these disappearances coincides with the places Samuel's lived." Claire's stomach churned. "We need to tell Tom. He's the only one who can do something about this." But as they planned their next move, a car engine revved outside, and Samuel's shadow passed by her window. The realization hit Claire like a thunderbolt. He knew. And that, she decided. She knew. The dining table glowed under the warm light of a chandelier. Neighbors chattered over steaming plates of casserole and fresh bread, laughter masking the undercurrent of tension. Claire sat rigid, gripping her wineglass, her gaze locked on Samuel, who was regaling the group with one of his usual anecdotes. She cleared her throat, the sound cutting through the conversation like a blade. "Samuel," she began, her voice trembling but resolute, "can you explain these?" She slid a folder onto the table. The clipped articles spilled out, headlines about missing women, marked with notes and dates. Gasps rippled through the group. Samuel froze, his smile faltering. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What's this, Claire?" "You tell me," she shot back, her words sharp. "Why do you have these? Why do they match the places you've lived?" It was as if the death of her brother had been some sort of tragic pun. The room went silent. Then Samuel laughed, a low, unsettling chuckle. "You're grasping at straws, Claire. This is ridiculous." His mocking tone sent a chill down her spine. The others exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to believe. Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "I think I've had enough of this circus." He stormed out, leaving a cloud of suspicion in his wake. The neighborhood had settled into its usual quiet, but Claire lay awake, her mind replaying the dinner confrontation. The folder, now locked in her desk, felt like a ticking bomb. Suddenly, a scream pierced the night, a sound so raw and primal it made her blood run cold. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. The sound had come from Samuel's house. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Tom. "Tom, it's Claire. There's something going on at Samuel's. I think someone's hurt." Tom's voice was calm but firm. "Stay inside. I'm on my way." Minutes later, she watched from her window as Tom approached Samuel's house, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. She pressed a hand to her chest, willing her heart to slow, but dread coiled tightly in her gut. Tom moved with the cautious precision of someone who had spent decades navigating dangerous situations. The driveway was littered with hastily packed boxes, their contents spilling onto the pavement. Clothing, papers, even a small leather journal. "Samuel," Tom called, his voice steady but commanding. The garage door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, Tom's flashlight revealed a jumbled mess of cleaning supplies and a rolled-up tarp stained with something dark. He breathed a sigh of relief when he saw how they looked, and then locked the door behind them. They huddled together on the bed, neither speaking. Before he could process the scene, a figure darted from the shadows, sprinting toward the backyard. "Stop!" Tom barked, giving chase. Samuel's escape was cut short as Tom tackled him to the ground. The two men grappled, the flashlight spinning wildly and casting eerie shapes against the trees. "Let me go," Samuel growled, thrashing violently. "I think we know." "You're not going anywhere," Tom grunted, pinning him down. From her porch, Claire watched in horror. She couldn't stand by any longer. Running across the street, she grabbed a fallen branch and thrust it toward Tom, who used it to secure Samuel's arms. Samuel sneered up at her. "You don't understand what you're doing, Claire. You're making a mistake." Her voice shook, but her resolve didn't waver. "The only mistake I made was trusting you." By the time the police arrived, Samuel was subdued, his hands cuffed behind his back. Officers swarmed the property, their movements swift and deliberate. The basement door was pried open, revealing a descent into a nightmare. The smell hit first, decay mingled with bleach. The walls were lined with shelves, each one displaying chilling trophies, lockets, rings, even photographs of women who had been reported missing. Detectives cataloged every grotesque detail. A diary lay open on the table, its pages filled with chilling accounts of his crimes, meticulously planned, coldly executed. The suspects, murderously rampaged, mutilated people jogging naked, missing limbs, obscene teeth, and cat. Claire stood outside, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. The sight of Samuel being led away in cuffs didn't bring relief, only a hollow ache. Her hands stilled, and she tried to reason. The next morning, the story broke. News vans lined the street, their cameras trained on Samuel's house. The headline read, "Suburban Neighbor Exposed as Serial Killer." Investigators confirmed what Claire and the others had feared. Samuel Dawson wasn't just a predator. He was a long-wanted fugitive, tied to disappearances across the state. He changed his name, built a new life, Tom explained to Claire over coffee, his face lined with exhaustion. But people like him can't stay hidden forever. Claire nodded, her thoughts swirling. She had let him into her life, her home, even her heart. The betrayal cut deeper than she could express. As she stared out the window at the gathering media, one thought lingered. How many other neighborhoods harbored secrets like Samuel's? The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantel. Claire sat alone on the couch, her hands trembling as she sifted through her memories of Samuel. Each interaction, once a source of comfort, now felt like a puzzle piece that she'd failed to assemble correctly. She remembered his easy laughter, the way he always seemed to know when she needed help. "You're stronger than you think, Claire," he'd said when she confided in him about her struggles. That same voice now echoed in her mind, tinged with malice she hadn't noticed before. Her stomach churned as she thought of Liam. She had let Samuel into her home, into her son's life, without a second thought. The guilt was suffocating, her failure to protect her family gnawing at her like a persistent ache. "Mom?" Liam's small voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. She turned to see him standing at the bottom of the stairs, clutching his stuffed bear. "Did Mr. Dawson do something bad?" Her throat tightened. "Come here, sweetheart," she whispered, pulling him into her arms. "I'll always keep you safe. I promise." The next morning, Ellen arrived unannounced, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. Claire opened the door, her face pale and drawn. "I figured you could use this," Ellen said softly, stepping inside. Claire managed a weak smile as she took the cup. Thanks. I feel like I'm falling apart." Ellen sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Listen, Claire, what happened isn't your fault. People like Samuel, manipulators. They're experts at hiding who they really are. He preyed on your grief, your trust." Claire looked down at her coffee, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "But how did I not see it? How could I have let him get so close?" "You're human," Ellen said gently. "You wanted to believe in someone. That doesn't make you weak." Outside, the once lively cul-de-sac had fallen into an eerie silence. Houses that once buzzed with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting were now closed off, blinds drawn tight. Tom stood on his porch, arms crossed as he watched reporters set up their cameras along the street. The headlines were everywhere. "Serial killer next door," "Suburb of secrets." The Harpers walked by, their eyes averted, their usual greetings replaced by uneasy nods. In the days that followed, whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you hear what they found in his basement?" one neighbor muttered to another. "How could we have lived next to someone like that?" Claire avoided stepping outside, the weight of the neighborhood's collective shock pressing down on her. She couldn't escape the stares, the unspoken questions about how she had been so close to someone capable of such horrors. Months later, Claire sat in a crowded courtroom, her palms damp as she clutched Ellen's hand for support. Samuel sat a few feet away, his face a mask of indifference as the prosecutor detailed his crimes. Over the course of 15 years, the defendant targeted vulnerable women, earning their trust before ending their lives, the prosecutor said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. Each disappearance, meticulously planned, each victim stripped of their future. The gallery was filled with victims' families, their tearful testimonies cutting through the air like knives. A mother spoke of her daughter's bright smile, now just a memory. A sister described endless nights of searching, only to be met with silence. Claire's chest tightened as she listened. She had been another pawn in Samuel's game, another life he had manipulated for his own gain. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, an audible gasp rippled through the room. Samuel's stoic demeanor cracked for the briefest moment, a flicker of anger crossing his face before he was led away in handcuffs. Back home, Claire stared at her reflection in the mirror. She looked older, the weight of the past year etched into her features. But beneath the exhaustion was a spark of determination. She opened her laptop and began typing. Her first email was to a local advocacy group that supported families of missing persons. "I want to help," she wrote, her fingers trembling as she hit send. In the weeks that followed, Claire threw herself into the work. She spoke at events, sharing her story, warning others to trust their instincts and recognize the signs of manipulation. Every small victory, a family finding closure, a missing person case reopened, felt like a step toward reclaiming her strength. The cul-de-sac slowly began to heal. Neighbors who once avoided each other now exchanged warm smiles. their shared trauma forging stronger bonds. Tom organized a neighborhood watch program, ensuring no one ever felt unsafe again. The Harpers hosted block parties, their laughter filling the air once more. Question 5. One evening, Claire stood on her porch, watching Liam ride his bike with the other kids. Ellen joined her, handing her a glass of iced tea. "You've done good, Claire," Ellen said, her voice filled with pride. Claire nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "We all have." The street was no longer just a collection of houses. It was a community, a family. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they served as a reminder of their resilience, their strength, and their commitment to never let darkness take root in their lives again. The street had returned to its quiet demeanor, but for Claire, peace felt unattainable. She stood by her window, staring at Samuel's house, now dark and empty. The same walls that once held warmth and welcome had concealed horrors she couldn't begin to fathom. How could someone so ordinary, so neighborly, be capable of such evil, she wondered. But then, she thought, her mind replayed every shared moment. The friendly smiles, the kind gestures, the trust he had built so effortlessly. Samuel's charm wasn't an accident. It was a mask, perfectly crafted to disarm suspicion and weave himself into the fabric of their lives. "It was all a lie," she muttered, her voice shaking. But it wasn't just his facade that haunted her. It was how easily she had believed it. The illusion of his innocence had been flawless, a chilling reminder that even the most vigilant can be deceived. The next morning, Claire sat with Ellen on the porch. The air was crisp, the silence between them heavy. "You know," Claire began, her voice breaking slightly, "I think deep down I always felt something was off. Little things, like the way he avoided questions, or how his stories never quite added up." Ellen nodded. "That's your intuition, Claire. It's always there, nudging you, even when you don't want to listen." Claire sighed, gripping her mug tightly. "But what if I had acted sooner? What if I had trusted that feeling instead of brushing it aside?" Here she looked helplessly at the mug. Then, at last, she glanced out. Ellen placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We all ignore those instincts sometimes. It's easier to believe the best in people. But next time, trust yourself. Even the smallest inconsistency can mean something." As the days passed, the cul-de-sac began to feel less like home. The neighbors, once friendly and welcoming, now eyed each other warily. Every interaction was tinged with suspicion, every conversation shadowed by doubt. "I don't even know who to trust anymore," Mrs. Harper confided to Tom as they passed each other on the sidewalk. "First Samuel, and now, who's to say there aren't more secrets?" Tom, ever the stoic former cop, shook his head. "Trust doesn't just vanish overnight, but it takes a hit like this to realize how fragile it really is." Claire overheard their exchange from her garden. She felt the weight of their words. Trust had been the foundation of their little community, and now it lay in ruins. It was over for the binding promise. For far too long, the binding promise had been the one true thing between the two of them. One evening, Claire sat down with Liam at the dining table. He was doodling in his sketchbook, blissfully unaware of the depth of the trauma surrounding them. "Liam," she began gently, "do you remember when we talked about paying attention to how people make you feel?" He nodded, his big eyes curious. "It's important," she continued, "to trust those feelings. If something doesn't feel right, if someone seems different, you should always talk to me about it." Liam tilted his head. "Like when Mr. Dawson was acting weird?" Claire's heart clenched, but she managed a soft smile. "Exactly. We have to look out for each other, okay?" He nodded, and she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, through vigilance and open conversations, they could rebuild what was broken. That night, as Claire sat alone in the quiet of her living room, a question lingered in her mind. How many others like Samuel are out there? She stared out the window at the empty street, the glow of a single street lamp casting long shadows. Somewhere, in another town, behind another welcoming smile, another secret could be hiding in plain sight. Her thoughts settled uneasily as she whispered to herself, "You never really know your neighbors, do you?" Meanwhile, monstrosities in the empire continued, and the free-range international trade fleet moved deep. The room seemed to grow colder, the silence heavier, as the weight of that truth pressed down on her.